Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, truly fascinating era in history. We're looking at the Indian socio-religious reform movements, but specifically, we're going to trace how two immense struggles ran totally parallel to each other. On one hand, the emancipation of women, and on the other, the fierce fight against caste-based exploitation. Together, these two pillars literally laid the foundation for modern equality in India. It's an incredible story, full of grassroots activism, profound ideological shifts, and total systemic overhauls. So let's get into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the rise of women's organizations, then explore the egalitarian shift in their activism. From there, we'll shift gears to look at the fracturing of the caste system, hear some powerful voices from the margins, and finally see how all of this equality was enshrined in law.
Section 1. The Rise of Women's Organizations, from Philanthropy to Action.
Let's move through the timeline and see how this actually builds. The real momentum starts right at the dawn of the 20th century. In 1904, Ramabai founded the Ladies' Social Conference in Bombay. Fast forward to 1910, and Sarla Devi Chaudhurani convenes the Bharat Stree Mahamandal. Now this is widely considered the first major Indian women's organization actually set up by a woman. Their main targets? Abolishing the purdah system, the practice of female seclusion, and really pushing for women's education. By 1925, the National Council of Women in India is formed, backed by champions like Ramabai. She passionately argued that things like female seclusion, caste differences, and a sheer lack of education were the ultimate roadblocks to any real societal progress. And then, we hit a massive landmark in 1927, the founding of the All India Women's Conference by Margaret Cousins.
Section 2, the egalitarian shift, a new wave of activism. There's a really stark contrast in how these groups operated as time went on. Those early organizations achieved incredible things, for sure. They involved brilliant women like Cornelia Sorabji, India's very first lady barrister. But critics back then pointed out that their methods kind of mirrored an upper-class English philanthropic style. Basically, it was a top-down, aristocratic charity approach. But when the All India Women's Conference stepped onto the scene in 1927, it was a total game-changer. They brought this fierce, egalitarian approach to the table. They weren't just asking politely for charity anymore. They were straight up demanding social justice and equal rights for every single human being. They explicitly stated that the essentials of life absolutely should not be determined by the mere accident of your birth or your sex.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what happens when a movement shifts from basic philanthropy to demanding deep systemic equality. Just look at the sheer volume of legislation the AIWC helped push through over the decades. We're talking early victories in the 1920s and 30s like the Sarla Act, which restricted child marriage, then moving right through the 40s and 50s with things like the Factory Act and the Special Marriage Act. And it all culminates in these powerful workplace protections in the 60s and 70s, like the Maternity Benefits Act and the Equal Remuneration Act. These aren't just dry historical footnotes, right? These are the bedrock legal rights that millions of women rely on today.
So, we've seen how the fight for women's equality evolved and secured these monumental legal victories. But what about our second pillar? What were the forces that finally began to dismantle the incredibly rigid caste system?
Section 3. Fracturing the caste system. 5 pillars of mitigation.
We can actually break down the mitigation of caste discrimination into 5 main factors. We've got the unintentional impacts of British rule, the deliberate strides made by social reform movements, the core principles of liberty and equality from the national movement, powerful grassroots uprisings directly from lower castes, and ultimately the constitutional guarantees of a free India. First, let's contrast the unintentional changes with the intentional ones. British administrative and economic measures accidentally threw a massive wrench into the caste system. By establishing private property, allowing the free sale of land, and opening up modern commerce, they basically crumbled the old village autarky, or self-sufficiency. You just couldn't maintain the strict, traditional link between caste and a specific vocation when urbanization was shifting everyone around. On top of that, introducing equality before the law dealt a huge blow to the traditional judicial power of local caste village councils. Now, contrast that with intentional social reform. Groups like the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj, and the Ramakrishna Mission actively and purposefully went out to spread education. They directly fought against those cruel restrictions that kept marginalized groups from entering temples or even using public water tanks.
Adding major fuel to that momentum was the national movement itself. Inspired by liberty and equality, national leaders realized something crucial. They couldn't successfully fight for freedom from the British while remaining so deeply divided at home. Because of this, caste divisions were somewhat diluted through mass participation in satyagrahas, those large-scale nonviolent resistance campaigns. In 1937, Congress governments in various provinces actually introduced free education for the depressed classes. And Mahatma Gandhi, driven by a deep sense of humanism, argued passionately that the ancient Hindu texts, the Shastras, didn't actually sanction untouchability. And he went even further, saying that even if they did, truth shouldn't be confined to a book. To really push this cause forward, he founded the All India Harijan Sangh in 1932, specifically to uplift depressed classes and root out untouchability once and for all.
Section 4. Voices from the Margins, Grassroots Uprisings and Leaders.
Now, demanding rights wasn't just radical back then, it was genuinely dangerous. Yet as education spread, marginalized communities began rising up and demanding their own rights, sparking powerful movements from the ground up. In Maharashtra, Jyotiba Phule led a formidable push against Brahmanical domination, placing massive priority on education, especially for lower caste girls. Down in South India during the 1920s, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar galvanized the masses with the self-respect movement. We also saw leaders like the Maharaja of Kolhapur encouraging non-Brahmin movements that actually united intermediate castes with Muslims. And of course, we have to talk about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Having experienced the absolute worst forms of discrimination himself, he organized the All India Scheduled Caste Federation and dedicated his entire life to fighting upper caste tyranny.
Now, what's really interesting here is the radical evolution of philosophical thought. Take Sri Narayana Guru, for example. He led a lifelong struggle against upper caste domination in Kerala, and he coined this beautifully inclusive slogan, "One religion, one caste, one God for mankind." But look at what happens later. His disciple, Sahadarthan Ayappan, actually adapts it to no religion, no caste, no God for mankind. It is fascinating. It perfectly captures how the intellectual resistance to caste-based oppression was becoming increasingly radical and absolutely uncompromising.
This uncompromising spirit was really operationalized by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar when he set up the Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha in 1924. His goal was to highlight the specific grievances of Dalits to the government. But his method wasn't just hopeful wishing. It was a highly structured, three-pronged strategy. Step 1, educate. You have to arm the people with knowledge. Step 2, agitate. Actively challenge regressive customs and loudly demand rights. And step 3, organize. Build the actual political and social machinery required to sustain this massive fight for self-elevation and self-respect. And that agitation, it took very tangible physical forms. A prime example is the Mahad Satyagraha in March of 1927, where they directly challenged the ban on lower castes accessing public water. Following that, in December, Dr. Ambedkar and his colleagues took a truly monumental step. At that very same location, they publicly burnt the Manusmriti, the ancient legal text that was historically used to justify caste oppression. This was an incredibly heavy, powerful symbolic gesture. They were literally and figuratively destroying the text that perpetuated this whole idea of high and low status based solely on birth.
Section 5. Equality enshrined in law, the promise of the Constitution.
So the crucial point we need to take away here is that true, lasting systemic change was heavily bottlenecked by colonialism. During the British era, the foreign government simply couldn't afford to invite a hostile reaction from orthodox sections of society. That severely limited their ability to enact any truly radical social measures. Ultimately, social uplift was intrinsically tied to political and economic uplift. It required a fully sovereign nation. It was only with the drafting of the Constitution of a free India that equality and non-discrimination became an absolute, non-negotiable legal imperative.
And this is exactly how those dual pillars of reform, the fierce fight for gender equality and the dismantling of the caste system, were finally chiseled into the bedrock law of the land. The Constitution abolishes untouchability completely. It declares any enforcement of disability arising from it as totally unlawful. It legally forbids any restriction on access to public spaces, literally the very wells, tanks, and institutions that social reformers had shed blood, sweat, and tears to open up for decades. And perhaps most beautifully, through its directive principles, it explicitly mandates that the state must strive to secure a social order based purely on social, economic, and political justice.
We've seen how the tireless work of early women's organizations shifting toward fierce egalitarianism, combined with the multifaceted fracturing of the caste system, forged the foundational promise of a newly free nation. The Constitution promised a social order based on justice. But as we reflect on this incredible history, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Looking at the world around us right now, today, how far have we truly carried these dual pillars of reform into our modern lives? The blueprint for equality was drawn up through immense struggle. But the building of that society? Well, that's an ongoing project. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.